Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a close look at how a massive, highly coordinated global manufacturing shift is quietly redrawing the world map. And honestly, it's probably reshaping the supply chain of the very device you're watching this on right now. Over the last 20 years, the architecture of global trade hasn't just been evolving, it's been fundamentally re-engineered from the ground up. And sitting right at the absolute center of this transformation is a concept you might not hear a lot about on the evening news, but it is literally dictating the flow of billions of dollars globally. To help wrap our heads around this incredibly complex topic, we've got a structured itinerary for us today. First up, China's global blueprint. Second, from policy to mega projects. Third, a tour of the zones. Fourth, the strategic master plan. Fifth, the host country balance sheet. And we'll wrap it all up with the future of global trade. So let's jump in. Section 1, China's global industrial blueprint. We're going to start our journey by zooming all the way out to look at the sheer, undeniable scale of this phenomenon. Just look at this staggering number, $57.13 billion. That represents the estimated cumulative investment by Chinese enterprises across Belt and Road zones as of 2022, and that's according to official data from China's Ministry of Commerce. We aren't just talking about a couple of isolated factories popping up here and there. No, we are talking about a systemic, global deployment of capital, infrastructure, and pure industrial capacity. But before we get completely lost in the alphabet soup, let's make sure we clearly define what exactly we're talking about. An OETCZ stands for Overseas Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone. Essentially, it is a highly coordinated mechanism for exporting China's entire industrial ecosystem onto foreign soil. Imagine a geographically fenced-off area in a host country where a Chinese developer comes in, builds the roads, the power plants, the water treatment facilities, the whole shebang, and then recruits a cluster of predominantly Chinese manufacturing firms to set up shop. It's what Beijing officially defines as government-guided, enterprise-led, and market-oriented. Moving right along to Section 2, from policy to mega projects. What's really fascinating here is how this massive structural shift actually got its start. It certainly didn't happen overnight. You can actually trace the timeline quite clearly. It kicked off back in 1999 with China's Go Global strategy, which basically encouraged domestic firms to step out and test international markets. But the real game changer happened in 2006. That's when the Ministry of Commerce initiated a formal tender process, heavily subsidizing these zones and shifting them from ad hoc private ventures into formal, centrally directed instruments of state economic policy. Then, in 2013, the whole thing was supercharged when these zones were directly integrated into the sprawling Belt and Road Initiative, basically acting as the terrestrial anchors for global supply chains. And this brilliantly illustrates the strategic pivot. If you're familiar with modern Chinese history, you probably know about their domestic special economic zones like Shenzhen back in the 1980s. Well, those domestic zones were specifically designed to pull foreign capital and technology in. But these new overseas zones, they are the exact inverse. They are explicitly designed to push surplus Chinese industrial capacity and capital out into the developing world. All right, Section 3, a tour of the zones. To make all of this a bit more concrete, let's do a rapid geographic hop and look at how these zones adapt to drastically varying local environments across the globe. The sheer diversity we're looking at here is pretty incredible. Over in Cambodia, the Sihanoukville zone literally transformed barren terrain into a massive hub for textiles and hardware, boasting over 20,000 jobs and a brand new $500 million tire plant. Down in Zambia, the Chambishi zone is all about copper mining and smelting. It was an early pioneer, though it has faced some notable environmental friction along the way. And over in Vietnam, the Long Giang Park is a premier destination for export processing, specifically utilized by firms looking to legally bypass Western trade tariffs. So as you can see, every single zone is uniquely tailored to extract whatever local advantages are available. Now let's zoom into Eastern Europe for a second and look at Belarus, specifically the Great Stone Industrial Park. This equity breakdown reveals something super fascinating about how these zones operate on a geopolitical level. Chinese state-backed entities hold a commanding 68% equity stake, while the Belarusian government holds the remaining 32%. For a country like Belarus, this zone acts as a brilliant strategic hedge. It allows them to attract high-tech foreign investment and project a bit of diplomatic independence without completely altering their heavy geopolitical reliance on Russia. I absolutely love this phrase from the source material. It hits the nail on the head when describing the mini China analogy, building a nest to accommodate the phoenix.
You see, navigating a completely foreign legal system or dealing with rolling local power outages is incredibly risky for a mid-sized Chinese manufacturer. So the zone developers act as the nest builders. They actively coordinate with state banks, secure the land rights, and essentially replicate familiar Chinese ecosystems so that smaller companies, the phoenixes in this analogy, can safely land and operate, perfectly shielded from local institutional risks.
Section 4, the Strategic Master Plan. Let's deconstruct the architecture of Beijing's grand strategy here. What is the actual ultimate goal? Well, far from just being simple real estate plays, these zones are the terrestrial anchors of a highly coordinated master plan. Step 1 is simply exporting excess domestic capacity. We're talking about things like steel, textiles, and building materials. Step 2, as we just touched on, is mitigating risk for small to medium enterprises. Step 3 is absolutely crucial in today's climate, evading tariffs. By using a China plus one relocation strategy, parts can be shipped from mainland China to a zone in, say, Vietnam, fully assembled there, and then legally exported to the US or EU under much, much lower tariffs. And finally, Step 4. These zones basically guarantee the long-term freight revenue that anchors the broader Belt and Road global logistics network. When we hold this up against the famous Singapore model of industrial parks, the contrast is kind of night and day. The Singapore model prioritizes software, meaning they focus on exporting institutional governance, administrative transparency, and anti-corruption frameworks. The Chinese model, on the other hand, unapologetically prioritizes hardware. It's all about the rapid, massive deployment of physical infrastructure. They're pouring concrete, laying massive power grids, and establishing these tightly closed-loop supply chains.
Which brings us to Section 5, Host Country Balance Sheet. So what does the ledger actually look like for the host nations that are welcoming these massive mega projects?
Do these zones actually transform local economies? That's the multi-billion-dollar question we've got to answer, objectively, sticking strictly to the data from our sources. Well, on the plus side of the ledger, official metrics show some undeniable, massive short-term benefits. For countries that are starved for investment, these zones provide a true turnkey solution. You get a massive influx of foreign direct investment, you get world-class infrastructure seemingly overnight, and you get immediate integration into global value chains. Officially, these zones have generated over 421,000 local jobs and an impressive $6.6 billion in tax revenues by 2022. They act as incredibly powerful catalysts for raw export volume generation. But balancing the ledger immediately, independent academic research points to some severe structural risks. The most pervasive economic critique is the dangerous enclave nature of these zones. Let's take the Teta Suez zone in Egypt, for example. Research shows that Chinese firms there often import their machinery, their raw materials, and even their management directly from China, assembling goods primarily for export. This vertical integration severely chokes off local tech transfer and stunts domestic supplier growth. Add to that concerns over conflated job data, meaning temporary construction jobs mixed in with permanent ones, highly asymmetrical contracts that limit actual tax yields, and serious localized friction over land displacement and environmental degradation. And this brilliantly highlights a truly fascinating geopolitical friction point regarding sovereignty. You often hear people casually claim that these zones are extraterritorial colonies. Legally, that is completely false. De jure, the host nation absolutely owns the land and enforces the laws. However, de facto sovereignty is a totally different story. The sheer financial asymmetry between a multi-billion-dollar Chinese state-owned enterprise and an under-resourced local municipal government means the developer often wields the actual power on the ground. To appease these developers, host nations frequently tailor or relax labor and tax laws, which severely compromises local regulatory enforcement. Finally, Section 6, the future of global trade. As we wrap up this explainer, let's take a look at where all of this is heading over the next decade. The days of cheap, heavily polluting garment manufacturing, those are decisively coming to an end. The next evolution is heavily pivoting toward the digital economy, AI, and green ESG-compliant industrial hubs. At the exact same time, we're seeing increasingly savvy host governments waking up to that enclave problem we discussed. They are now actively demanding structurally integrated deals, mandating legal tech transfer quotas, and insisting on local supplier integration. And with the ongoing geopolitical push to de-risk global supply chains, these zones are going to be in exceptionally high demand to build the batteries and electric vehicles that you'll be driving tomorrow. I want you to really let this quote from the report sink in, because it perfectly captures the incredibly high stakes of this global architectural shift. It's not just about the millions of tons of concrete poured or the sheer capital spent. It's about whether these host nations can actually utilize these zones to empower their own independent long-term economic sovereignty.
Based on the ledger we just went through, weighing that massive influx of infrastructure on one hand against the very real risks of isolated enclave economies on the other, are these zones a stepping stone to global industrialization or just a new form of asymmetrical dependency? I'll leave that up to you to decide. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how our world is being built.